I remember the smell before anything else. Coffee, lightly burnt, just the way he liked it. Not fresh, not fragrant, just bitter enough to wake the nerves and scald the tongue. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, holding the chipped blue mug he used every single morning for nearly 5 decades, the same one I threatened to throw out every year and somehow never did. He was already sitting at the table, reading the same newspaper he always did. Even though the print had gotten smaller and his eyesight weaker, he refused to wear glasses. Said they made him look old, as if time hadn't already drawn lines across his hands and softened the volume of his voice. Toast? I asked, more out of habit than need. He didn't look up, just grunted. I placed the plate down in front of him, 2 slices of dry wheat toast, no butter. He had stopped eating butter 3 years ago, after that second scare with his heart. Not because the doctor insisted, but because he was suddenly obsessed with control of his body, his food. Even the air we breathed had to be filtered by some noisy machine he placed in our bedroom. We didn't speak much anymore, not out of anger, but erosion, like waves washing over the same rock for 50 years. There's simply not much left to say once everything's been worn smooth. Still, I watched him eat, the way he chewed slowly, lips pressed tightly, the way his hands trembled just slightly when he reached for the coffee. His wedding band hung loosely on his finger now, almost as if it didn't want to be there anymore. "I have my checkup today," he said without looking at me. First words of the morning. I nodded. "Need me to drive?" He shook his head. "I'll take the bus." That was odd. He hated the bus. Said it smelled like people who had given up. I wiped my hands on a towel that had holes at the corners. He had refused to let me buy new ones. "Waste of money," he always said, even though we had enough to change every towel in the house 100 times over. We moved slowly that morning, or maybe the air was just thicker. I kept glancing at the clock, though I had nowhere to be. Something in my stomach twisted, but I ignored it. After all, this was just another Thursday. He stood up without finishing his coffee. "You're not taking the mug?" I asked. He always took it with him. Some strange comfort, I suppose. "Leave it," he muttered. "I don't want it anymore." He didn't kiss me goodbye, but then again, he hadn't done that in years. I heard the front door close, quietly but firmly, and then the long, slow creak of the front gate. And then silence. At first, I stood still in the middle of the kitchen, unsure what to do with myself. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum lower. I washed his mug and left it upside down on the drying rack, thinking he'd be back by lunchtime. He never came back. It wasn't a car accident. It wasn't even sudden. The hospital said it was expected. His condition had worsened. But that's the thing about slow deaths. The living don't always see them coming. When I arrived at the hospital, the nurse met me with a tilt of the head and hands clasped too tightly in front of her. I knew before she said anything. "He asked for you," she whispered, "but you didn't pick up your phone." I hadn't even noticed it ringing. I had left it charging in the bedroom. We never called each other anymore, so why would I think to check? I walked into the room alone. He was already covered with a white sheet, his feet sticking out like punctuation marks. I sat beside the bed for a long time, didn't cry, didn't scream. I just stared at his hands, the same hands that built the crib for our son, patched the roof during storms, buttoned my dresses when my fingers hurt. I reached out and touched them one last time. They were still warm. I think that's what broke me. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror that morning. My face looked too composed, too dry. No tears, just skin and shadows. I pulled my hair back into a bun, not out of vanity, but function. Grief makes you efficient in strange ways. I wore a navy blue dress, the same one I wore to his cousin's funeral 7 years ago. He always said it made me look formal. I didn't want to be beautiful. I wanted to disappear. The funeral home smelled like furniture polish and flowers pretending not to die. Everything was upholstered, beige, and quiet, as if grief needed to be muffled. I walked in alone, holding a small black purse and a folded tissue I never used. People were already seated when I arrived. Rows of familiar backs, neighbors, distant cousins, our sons. None of them turned when I entered. No one rose. No one offered an arm or even a nod. I was the widow, yes, but I felt like a guest in someone else's farewell. My youngest son, Daniel, sat in the second row. He didn't save me a seat. His wife sat beside him, legs crossed, whispering into her phone. The older one, Miguel, was up front, jaw locked, arms crossed. He didn't look back once. I sat by myself. During the service, the pastor spoke of a good man, a provider, a quiet strength. Words that felt oddly detached, generic even. No stories, no laughter, no specifics, just a resume of virtues, the kind they use when they don't really know the person. But what struck me wasn't what was said, it was who was crying. In the third row, near the aisle, sat a young man I didn't know, late 20s maybe, curly dark hair, clean suit, hands trembling around a crumpled tissue. He was crying in deep, shuddering waves, the kind of grief that collapses the chest. I'd never seen him before, and yet he cried like someone who had lost a father. I kept watching him from the corner of my eye. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't look around, just stared at the closed casket like it held the last light on earth. After the service, I stood near the doors, as custom dictated. That awful ritual, the widow receiving condolences like someone taking returns at a department store. Such a good man, someone murmured. You were lucky, said another without irony. Most of them didn't meet my eyes. Their hugs were perfunctory, their hands cold. I was a symbol now, not a person, a shape of mourning they had to acknowledge before they went back to their own lives. Daniel brushed past me. We'll call you later, okay? He mumbled, not even waiting for my reply. His wife had already turned to the parking lot. Miguel didn't say a word. I stood there for 15 minutes after the last person had gone. The young man, the one who cried, never approached me. He vanished before the service ended, slipped out the side, unnoticed, like a ghost. I rode home in a car, driven by a man from the funeral home. He asked if I wanted to play music. I said no. The silence in the car felt safer than conversation. Back at the house, everything was exactly as we left it. His shoes still by the door, the tea towel still on the hook, his coffee mug, the one I washed that morning, dry on the rack, waiting for hands that would never hold it again. I stood in the living room, surrounded by years of things we built, and suddenly I couldn't remember why any of them mattered. The couch we fought on, the lamp we bought on vacation, the painting we argued about for days and then never hung. It all felt like props on a stage where the actors had forgotten their lines. I sat down slowly, my hands resting on my knees. And for the first time since the hospital, I whispered the words I hadn't let myself say out loud. Who were you, really? Because I had the sickening, quiet sense, the kind that doesn't shout but settles into your bones, that I had spent 50 years married to a man I never fully knew. And now he was gone. And the answers, whatever they were, had been buried with him, or so I thought. The morning after the funeral, the house felt colder, not in temperature. The sun still warmed the curtains, the birds still chirped outside, but in spirit. I walked from room to room like a guest in my own home, straightening things that didn't need fixing, touching objects just to prove I still existed among them. The phone didn't ring, no one came by. Grief, I've learned, is not loud. It's not the sobbing or the trembling hands you see in movies. Real grief is quiet. It's making tea for two, then staring at the second cup until it turns cold. It's folding his sweater and catching yourself whispering, I'll just put this away for now, as if now meant something. I hadn't seen my sons since the funeral. No calls, no check-ins. I wasn't surprised, just hollowed out. After all, they had their own lives. grown men with jobs, kids, wives. I told myself not to take it personally, but the truth is I did. I took it very personally. By mid-afternoon, I decided to make soup, not because I was hungry, but because he always liked it after funerals. Chicken broth with rice and a squeeze of lemon. Comfort in a bowl. I chopped the onions slowly, letting the sting distract me. Maybe the tears would come easier that way. Just as I was reaching for the garlic, I heard the gate creak. Then footsteps. 2 sets. My heart lifted. Maybe Daniel, maybe Miguel. Maybe they'd come to check on me after all. I wiped my hands and opened the front door. It was Daniel and his wife, Sarah. She was holding a stack of papers, he a forced smile. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice had that tone, the one people use when they're about to ask for something. I opened the door wider. "Come in." They didn't hug me, not even a touch on the shoulder. They walked in like clients to a bank, polite, reserved, rehearsed. I gestured toward the kitchen. "I was making soup," Sarah cut in. "Actually, we can't stay long. We wanted to talk to you about some things. Legal things." She held out a folder. Daniel looked at the floor. Inside were documents, accounts, property titles, insurance policies, everything with his name, our house. I blinked. "You're sorting things already?" Daniel spoke, avoiding my eyes. "Dad didn't leave a will, so there's just some stuff we need to organize. We want to make sure everything's protected." "Protected from what?" I asked, softly. "From taxes, from complications. You know." I didn't know. I didn't understand why they were in such a hurry, why I felt like a formality in my own life. I looked at my son, my baby, the one I nursed through fevers, the one who used to sneak into our bed during thunderstorms, and I saw a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't cruel, just detached. I wanted him to say, "How are you holding up, Mom?" I wanted him to reach for my hand. I wanted him to cry, even just a little, for the father who raised him and the mother now left behind. But none of that came. Instead, Sarah flipped through the folder. "We'll need your signature on a few of these. It'll just make everything easier." I didn't sign. Not that day. I told them I needed time. They left soon after. No soup, no hug, not even a glance back as they walked through the gate. I stood by the door long after they'd gone. The breeze carried the scent of onion and lemon from the kitchen. The silence inside the house thickened again, wrapped around me like an old, heavy coat. That night, I slept on his side of the bed. Not because I missed him, but because I needed to remind myself that I still belonged in this house, that my body still had weight, that I wasn't just something he left behind to be processed and divided. And yet, something gnawed at me. The stranger from the funeral, the folder of legal papers, the urgency in Daniel's visit. It all felt like puzzle pieces dropped into my lap without a picture to guide me. I opened my nightstand drawer, searching for distraction, and found his reading glasses, still warm from the sun. I held them for a long time, and somewhere inside me, a voice whispered, "There's more. He left more than you know." It was the kind of box you walk past 100 times without noticing, wedged behind old coats in the back of the closet, half covered by a torn blanket we hadn't used since Miguel's college years. Blue, worn at the corners. The kind of blue that used to be brighter before dust and time had their way with it. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for a photograph. Something of us, maybe. Anything to make the obituary feel more personal. I thought perhaps one of the old albums had fallen behind the shelves, but instead, I found this small, heavy box, sealed not with a lock, but with care, almost reverence. At first, I didn't think much of it. I carried it to the edge of the bed and sat down, resting it on my knees like something fragile. Then I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them. neatly tied with thin brown string, yellowing paper, thick envelopes, each one addressed by hand. Not to me, not to anyone in our family. Every single one was written to a woman named Clara, and none of them had been sent. I stared at the name on the first envelope. My fingers froze mid-air. I didn't know a Clara, not from his past, not from any stories he'd ever told. The handwriting was his, no question. I recognized the way he wrote his L's, tall and slanted, like they were bracing themselves, and the smell, that old paper scent, tinged with ink and something faintly floral. He must have kept them sealed for decades. I untied the bundle. The top letter was dated August 14th, 1983, the summer our marriage hit one of its quieter storms, the time when we were living like polite strangers, raising two boys and sleeping back to back. I unfolded the page. Clara, today I saw someone wearing your perfume in the market. I stood there like a fool, breathing in the aisle. It took me back to the place I try not to think about. I heard your laugh in my head, and I swear for a moment, I thought you might be real again. I still can't say your name out loud. I promised her I'd move on. I promised myself. But here you are, in everything. I read it twice, and then again. Each line folded time in half. I wasn't reading the thoughts of my husband. I was reading the thoughts of a man I didn't know, or maybe never saw clearly. The second letter was softer. You would have loved the way the light hit the church this morning. I sat in the back, pretending to pray. What I really did was count how many people looked lonely. You'd say that's morbid. I think it's honest. She thinks I've found God, but I only ever found you. By the fourth letter, my hands began to tremble. I wasn't angry, not yet. I wasn't even hurt. I was displaced. Where had I been in these moments? Where was I in this version of his life? Clara. The name rolled in my mind like fog. I searched the box for photos, keepsakes, anything that might explain. But there were only letters, dozens of them, spanning years, some longer than others, some barely 2 lines, all unwritten confessions. And here's what disturbed me the most. He never mailed them, not a single one. They were never meant for anyone but him. And now, me. I closed the lid slowly and rested my hands on top of the box. The room suddenly felt heavier, as if every wall had shifted slightly inward. My ears rang in the silence. The fan above me spun without sound. What do you do with a man's inner life once he's gone? What do you do with the parts he kept locked away? Not in betrayal, perhaps, but in fear, in shame, in yearning? I didn't cry, not then. I placed the box on the bedside table and turned off the lamp. But that night, I slept with the window open, hoping that maybe, if the wind was just right, I might hear her name whispered through the trees. I woke up with his name on my lips, not in longing, not in grief, in confusion. For the first time since his passing, I realized I didn't know what to call him anymore. My husband? The man who lived in this house? The man who wrote love letters to a ghost? I made coffee, not the bitter kind he liked. I made it the way I used to, before we compromised everything, sweet with a touch of cinnamon, just for me. I sat at the kitchen table with the blue box in front of me, the morning light slanting through the blinds in quiet stripes. The letters were neatly restacked, but I hadn't tied them back up. Part of me didn't want to seal them again, as if doing so would silence him once more. I pulled out another envelope. May 1992. I remembered that year. Our older son had gotten suspended for sneaking out at night. He and I had fought about how to handle it. He wanted strict punishment. I wanted understanding. I remember telling him, "You're too cold sometimes." Now I wondered if he was simply somewhere else. Clara, some nights I still hear the door closing the way you used to. I wake up and forget whose house I'm in. She's a good woman. She really is. But she doesn't see me. Not the real me. She sees the provider, the father, the man who fixes broken sinks. But you saw the pieces I buried. And I hate you for that. And I love you for it. That letter made me put my coffee down. I wasn't angry at Clara. I wasn't even sure she was still alive. But I was angry at the idea that I, the woman who washed his clothes, bore his children, held his trembling hands through surgeries and disappointments, was seen as less real than someone who existed only in his mind. But then, as I read the next few letters, something began to shift in me. They weren't passionate love notes. They weren't filled with fantasies or regretful lust. They were meditations. He was writing not to a woman, but to a time, to a version of himself that had lived before life hardened him. Clara had become a mirror I never saw him hold. And slowly, quietly, the ache inside me began to change shape, because the more I read, the more I understood that Clara wasn't a betrayal. She was a wound, and he had spent 50 years trying to stop it from bleeding without ever pressing on it. In one letter, dated just 5 years ago, he wrote, "Clara, I think I've finally forgiven you, for leaving, for dying, for haunting me. But I don't know how to forgive myself. I married a woman who deserved all of me, and I only gave her the parts I wasn't afraid of. She never asked for more, and maybe that's why I loved her in my own quiet, cowardly way." I read that one 3 times. Clara had died. This wasn't some affair. It wasn't a hidden second life. It was loss. Deep, unresolved, unspoken loss. And I had lived beside it. For decades. That realization didn't bring me peace. Not yet. But it brought clarity. And with clarity comes a kind of justice, I suppose. I closed the box and placed it beneath my bed. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I needed time. I looked around the kitchen, saw the second chair at the table, and said aloud, not to him, but to myself, I was real too. I was here. And even if he never wrote it down, even if I wasn't the woman who stirred his memory in the aisles of grocery stores, I was the one who stayed. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside women like me. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that stacks itself over the years like folded sheets in a linen closet, tucked away, pressed flat, hidden behind smiles and casseroles. I started noticing it in the smallest places, the way I paused before speaking in a group, the way I said, "It's fine," when I meant, "This hurts." The way I sat through holidays pretending not to feel invisible when the men talked and the women cleared the dishes. That silence didn't start with his letters. It started long before Clara. It started when I learned that speaking up made people uncomfortable. When having needs meant being too much, when I was praised for being so strong, which I've come to understand often just means so quiet. I think I learned to swallow things before I ever learned to name them. I used to believe love meant keeping the peace, that it meant making yourself smaller so the other person could breathe. But over the years, that kind of love became a cage with soft pillows, comfortable but confining, beautiful from the outside, empty on the inside. After I found the letters, I started talking to myself more. Not out loud, not yet, but in thoughts I let stretch further than I ever used to. I'd sit in the chair by the window, where the afternoon light pooled like warm milk, and I'd ask, why didn't I ask more questions? Why didn't I ever say I was lonely? Why did I wait for permission to feel like a person? I used to blame time. We had the boys, bills, work, a mortgage, birthdays, anniversaries, doctors, grief. It always felt like life was too full to examine closely. But now, with the house so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from 3 rooms away. I had nothing but time. And questions, so many questions. I remembered once, maybe 15 years ago, when he came home late from work. He smelled different, not like perfume, not like guilt, but like dust and paper. I asked him where he'd been. He said, "Just had to clear my head." I didn't press. He looked tired. Now I wonder if he'd been writing. Maybe he had found a bench or a corner of a park, and opened that old blue box and poured himself onto the page, to her. Not because he loved her more, but because he believed she could still hold what he was afraid to give me. And yet, I never asked for more. That was my silence. He didn't know the dreams I buried because I never spoke them aloud. He didn't see the places I ached because I smiled too much, moved too quickly, changed the subject too often. He didn't know I still listened to our wedding song alone in the kitchen some nights because I wanted to feel like the woman I used to be. But then again, I didn't know the weight he carried either. Not really. Maybe we were both living a version of the truth that was just bearable enough to survive. Not happy, not tragic, just quiet. That night, I opened my old journal. I hadn't written in it in years. The pages were stiff, the ink in the pen nearly dried, but I began, slowly, carefully. I was not Clara. I was not a ghost or a memory. I was the woman who folded his shirts and forgave his silences. I was the one who stayed. The letters had not broken me, but they had exposed the places where I had already cracked. And now that he was gone, I wasn't sure who I was without the silence I had built my identity around. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. I didn't know where to go, only that I couldn't sit in that house another day, staring at the outline of his absence in every room. So I left. No destination, no errands, no lists. Just my coat, a scarf I hadn't worn in years, and my worn leather purse, the one with the stitched lining that was beginning to unravel. The air was crisp, not cold. Spring was trying to wake up, and the scent of wet soil followed me down the sidewalk. I passed neighbors without names, shops that had outlived their owners, and children who didn't look up from their phones. I ended up at the park, his park. He used to come here every Thursday after his doctor appointments. I always thought he lingered to avoid the traffic, or maybe to rest his legs before the long bus ride home. But now, I wondered. There was a bench beneath an old jacaranda tree, half hidden by a hedge that no one had properly trimmed. I had seen him sit there before. I never asked what he did there. Maybe he fed the birds. Maybe he just watched the world and pretended not to be a part of it. Now I sat there. The wood was damp, the metal armrest cold against my palm, but the moment I settled in, I felt something strange. Not peace, not sadness, but presence. Like I had finally entered a room he had kept locked. I looked around. Not many people. A woman pushing a stroller, a man walking his dog, birds pecking near the trash can. Ordinary life. But somehow it felt like I was watching it from the other side of glass. I pulled one of his letters from my purse. I had chosen this one carefully, dated just 2 years ago. Short, blunt, written in his angriest tone. Clara, you still come to me in dreams. Not the sweet kind, the ones where I wake up sweating and ashamed. I told her I was just having night sweats. She believed me. She always believes me. And I hate that. I hate that I built a life on lies too soft to catch fire. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it back inside my bag. He thought I believed everything. He thought I never saw through him, that I was too soft, too trusting. He was wrong. I had always seen more than I let on. I just never pushed. Not because I was weak, but because I thought love meant leaving space for someone's darkness, even when they never offered light in return. I watched the trees sway and thought about all the words we never exchanged. The time he sat on the porch with a suitcase he never opened. The nights he stared at the ceiling and said nothing. The moments I stood behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, and felt his body stiffen before he said he was just tired. They weren't betrayals. They were evasions. And I let them pass, because I was afraid of what might rise to the surface if I pulled too hard. But now, I was pulling. Not to punish, but to understand. I stayed on that bench for nearly 2 hours, not moving, just listening, not to the world, but to the echo of someone I'd lived beside without ever truly hearing. Then, just as I stood up to leave, I noticed something. Scratched into the wood of the bench, right near the right armrest, were 2 letters, C plus H, faint, old, almost worn away. It could have been anyone. But somehow, I knew. This was where he spoke to her, not in voice, but in memory. This bench was sacred to him, not because of Clara, but because here he was honest, even if only to himself. And now I was here too, breathing the same air, feeling the same wood beneath my palms, finishing the conversation. She didn't knock right away. I saw her from the kitchen window, standing still at the gate, one hand gripping the iron latch, the other holding something clutched to her chest. She looked unsure, like someone trying to remember if they had the right address. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything feel softer than it really is. The clouds were stretched thin, like pulled cotton, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old flowers. She looked to be in her mid-30s, maybe early 40s, dark hair tied in a loose bun, eyes searching, not just the house, but me. I dried my hands on a towel, smoothed my cardigan, and opened the door before she could ring. Our eyes met. "Hello," she said, almost breathlessly. Her voice was polite, practiced, but behind it there was something raw, something that hadn't healed right. I... I'm sorry to bother you. I just... She hesitated, then looked down at the envelope in her hand. "I was at the funeral. Your husband's." I stepped onto the porch. The air shifted slightly between us. "I remember," I said. "You sat near the back. You left early." She gave a soft, surprised nod. "Yes, I... I didn't know if I had the right to be there." Silence stretched between us like a thread pulled too tight. Then she took a breath. "May I speak with you? Just a moment. I don't want to disturb anything. I just need to give you something." There was something in her face, not guilt, not defiance, but grief. Grief shaped differently from mine, private, complicated, carefully folded and carried for years. I nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." She walked through the threshold like someone entering a sacred place. Her eyes scanned the photos on the wall, the vase on the table, the shoes by the door. Not with judgment, with familiarity. I led her into the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, spine straight, hands clutched together in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I've rehearsed this 100 times, but now that I'm here..." I sat across from her and waited. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Elena. I'm Clara's daughter." The name landed in the room like a bell, clear, echoing, irrevocable. Clara, the woman of the letters, the wound that never closed. I didn't speak. I let her continue. "My mother died when I was 9, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Cancer. She used to talk about him, about your husband. Not often, but when she did, it was always gentle, never angry. She said he was the only man who really saw her." She looked down, then up at me. "I know how that must sound." I said nothing. "I found letters," she continued, "after my mother passed. One of them had your address on it. I didn't come sooner because I didn't know what I was hoping to find. I still don't. But when I heard he'd died, I felt like I had to come, to bring you this." She handed me the envelope. It was old, unsealed. My name was written on the front, in his handwriting. "I think it was meant for you," she said. "I found it among her things. I never opened it." I took it slowly, my hands shaking. The paper was warm from her grip, and the ink slightly faded. "Would you like tea?" I asked, surprising myself. She blinked. Yes, I would." In the kitchen, I boiled the water in silence. My chest was tight, not with fear, with anticipation, the kind that comes before the final page of a book you're not sure you want to finish. When I returned, she was still sitting there, waiting. I placed the cup in her hands and sat again with the letter between us. "You don't have to read it now," she said softly. "I do," I replied, just as softly. I opened it. "If you're reading this, it means she kept it. Clara always kept things that hurt. I wrote this a long time ago, before the boys were grown, before we started sleeping like strangers. I want you to know, I never stopped loving you, but I didn't know how to love you right. You gave me a life, a home, a name, and I gave you a part of myself, but never all. I was afraid. You deserved more." I stopped reading. Tears slid down my face, quiet and unexpected. Not because of what he confessed, but because he knew. He knew he had left part of himself in shadow, and he knew I had stood in the light anyway. When I looked up, Elena's eyes were red too. "I'm not angry," I said. She nodded. "Neither am I." We drank our tea in silence, like two women who had finally stepped out from under the same ghost. A week passed before I could bring myself to open the drawer in his study. It still smelled like him: paper, old wood, a hint of shaving cream. His chair was pushed in neatly, his reading glasses rested on the desk beside a cracked leather notebook he hadn't touched in years. I had avoided this room for days, not because of what I might find, but because of what I feared I wouldn't: answers. But Elena's visit had shifted something: her presence, her pain. It had not wounded me. It had softened me, like warm rain over hard soil. I no longer needed to defend myself from the truth. I needed to meet it. I pulled the top drawer open: bills, warranty cards, receipts from a hardware store that closed a decade ago. Nothing remarkable. But then, under a stack of outdated manuals, I found a small black folder. Inside it were documents I'd never seen before: government papers, letters from an attorney, and at the very top, a birth certificate. Not his, a different name: Hector Manuel Delgado, born in 1943, same date of birth, same town, same parents, but a name I had never once heard him speak. I sat down slowly. The page blurred as I stared at it, trying to fit the puzzle together. I flipped through more papers: legal documents, a name change, dated 1970, the year after we married. He had changed his name, not for business, not for drama, for something deeper, something buried. Why didn't he ever tell me? At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note, addressed to no one. My mother always called me Manuel, but my father wanted Hector, said it sounded stronger. When she died, he stopped saying my name at all. I think that's when I started disappearing. Not all at once, just piece by piece. When I met her, I thought I could build a new self, but even in that life, I kept Clara. I was too many people, and not enough of any of them. My breath caught. I looked around the room: the bookshelves, the dusty trophies, the yellowed photograph of us on the beach, him with his arm around me, smiling with teeth he rarely showed. I never knew. 50 years. 50 years, and I didn't even know his real name. At first, the betrayal stung, but not in the way people expect, not the fiery kind. This was quieter, sadder, like finding out your favorite song was written for someone else, and yet somehow it still made you cry every time. I touched the name on the page: Hector, Manuel. Who was he really? And then, who had I been to him? A witness? A sanctuary? An audience? I sat in that study for hours, reading and rereading the documents, piecing together the private map of a man who had spent his life trying not to be found. He didn't lie to hurt me. He lied to survive himself. And as I folded the pages and returned them to the folder, I whispered aloud, "I forgive you." Not because he asked for it, not because I owed it, but because forgiveness was the only key I had left, and the lock had been sitting in this room for decades. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I said his name, the real one, into the darkness. "Manuel," I whispered, "I hope you found peace." And for the first time since his death, I felt something inside me exhale. The tape recorder was hidden in the bottom drawer of his nightstand, tucked behind an old handkerchief and a rusted flashlight that hadn't worked since 2012. I don't know what made me open that drawer. Maybe I was looking for the sound of him. After discovering the name he had buried and the woman he had mourned, I found myself longing, not for his voice in conversation, but for something unfiltered, something unscripted, something he didn't think I'd ever hear. It was a small, black device, outdated, but still intact. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its weight, heavier than it looked, like it held more than just tape. Inside was a single cassette, unmarked. I hesitated. I didn't know what would come through that tiny speaker: confession, memory, lies, or nothing at all. I took it to the living room and sat on the couch, placing it on the table like a relic. I pressed play, static, then silence, then his voice. If this is being heard, it means I didn't have the courage to say it out loud, which shouldn't surprise anyone. I've always been a coward when it comes to the heart. I froze. His voice was slower than I remembered, calmer, like he had rehearsed every word for days, maybe years. It wasn't the voice he used at the dinner table or in doctors' offices. It was raw. I need to say some things, not to clear my name, not to be forgiven, just so they exist outside my head." He paused. "I loved my wife. I need to say that first. I loved her in the way quiet men love, with steadiness, with presence. But I never gave her the parts of me that scared me, the soft parts, the broken parts. I let her believe I was solid, when really I was shattered in places I couldn't name." I covered my mouth. He continued, "Clara wasn't a lover. She was a ghost I never buried, and I let her haunt me, not because I loved her more, but because I didn't know how to grieve her. I built a life beside that pain, and I brought it into our home without asking permission. For that, I am sorry." I closed my eyes. The tears came quietly. "To the woman who stayed, you were more than I deserved. You were the soft place I never allowed myself to fall into. And that's not your fault. That's mine. You were never invisible. I just looked away too often. And now all I want is for you to finally look at yourself and see what I saw, but couldn't name." The tape clicked, paused, then rewound a few seconds and continued. "I didn't want to be remembered for the man I pretended to be. I wanted to be known, really known, even if it was too late." The recording ended, just like that. I sat there in stillness, the sound of the room suddenly louder than I could bear. The ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, a car passing outside, and then silence. But not the same kind. This silence was lighter, not empty, cleared. I reached for the recorder and held it to my chest, not because I needed to hear more, because for once I had heard enough. The man I loved had spoken, not in flowers or gestures, not in bedtime kisses or anniversary cards, but here, at last, in the language of vulnerability. The words he never said were the ones I needed most. And now that I had them, I could finally begin the part of life he never quite reached: honesty. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror that morning, not on purpose, just passing by, and for a moment I didn't move. It wasn't vanity, it was curiosity. I stared at the woman looking back at me like I had never truly seen her before. Her hair thinning in places, wrinkles deepened around the eyes, not from sorrow, but from squinting into sunlight for decades. Her shoulders slightly hunched from years of carrying laundry baskets, shopping bags, children, silence. But her eyes were steady, and she was still here. I placed a hand over my collarbone. The skin was warm, my breath steady. "I'm still alive," I whispered to no one. It wasn't a dramatic realization. There was no triumphant music, no tears, just a quiet, grounded truth settling in my chest. He was gone, but I remained. My body, this body, had carried me through 5 decades of quiet service. Through childbirth, grief, long dinners without thank yous, nights of lying awake, listening for the garage door. Through desire, I silenced. Through touch, I gave more than I received. And now, it was mine again. Not just biologically, but spiritually. That afternoon, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser and found the red dress. It wasn't scandalous, just slightly too bright for the woman I used to be. I had bought it nearly 15 years ago during a sale, tried it on once in secret, then tucked it away, telling myself it wasn't appropriate for my age. That day, I wore it, not for anyone, not for a date, not even for the mirror, for me. I made tea, sat on the porch, and let the sunlight kiss my arms bare. A neighbor waved, and I waved back, smiling in a way that didn't require explanation. Later, I pulled out my old radio, the one we used to keep in the kitchen before streaming and smartphones, and found a station playing classics from the 60s, Dusty Springfield, Etta James, Nat King Cole. I turned it up louder than usual. And then, I danced. Not like a young girl, not like a widow. Just like a woman with bones that still moved and a heart that still pulsed. My hips didn't glide the way they used to. My knees ached. My breath quickened faster than it should have. But I laughed, not because it was funny, because I was still here. I made myself dinner that night. Something I liked. No compromise, no, he doesn't care for that. Just roasted vegetables, soft bread, and a glass of red wine I'd saved for no occasion. and I sat at the head of the table, not the side where I always served, the head, where decisions are made, where stories begin, and when the house grew quiet again, I didn't reach for the television. I lit a candle. I ran a warm bath. I touched my own skin without apology, not in sadness, not in shame, but in quiet reverence. This is my body, not the one that served, not the one that waited, the one that remains. And as I sank into the bath, letting the water hold the parts of me that had never been held gently enough, I whispered once more, I am not just someone's wife. I am someone. The hydrangeas had started to bloom again, big, round clusters in shades of faded blue and pale lavender. He always called them old lady flowers. I always hated that nickname, but he still watered them. Every Sunday morning, rain or shine, he would leave the house with his small thermos of coffee and walk to the park, to that same bench under the jacaranda. I assumed it was habit. Now I knew better. That Sunday, I returned. It wasn't a decision exactly, more like gravity. Something in me needed to go back, not to grieve, but to listen. I wore my scarf, the soft one he never liked because it looked like curtains, and carried a thermos of my own. It felt right, not poetic, just human. When I arrived, the bench was empty, the same wood, the same slight lean to the left, the initials C+H still faintly etched into the side, like a whisper carved in wood. I sat down slowly. Around me, the world moved as it always had. Kids on scooters, a dog chasing birds, wind brushing through the trees like someone softly sweeping the sky. But in my chest, something felt still. I reached into my coat pocket, not even sure why, and there it was, a small folded note, not mine, not addressed. It had been tucked into the corner seam of the bench, barely visible unless you were looking. My fingers trembled. The handwriting was his. If you find this, it means I didn't get to tell you, not in the right way, not with the time you deserved. This bench is where I met my guilt, where I forgave myself a little every Sunday, not for Clara, for you, for all the times I made you feel second to a memory, for not giving you the full light of the man you married, for staying quiet when I should have held you. You were the anchor, the house, the season I always return to. And I hope, if you're here, it means you've forgiven me enough to sit in the place I prayed you'd one day understand. There was love in me, even when I couldn't say it. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, weathered by time and rain. I pressed the note to my chest, not to protect it, but to feel it. He hadn't left it for Clara, not for the boys, not for some version of himself. He had left it for me, here, in the place where he had tried to make peace with himself, with his secrets, with the woman who waited for him every Sunday without knowing she was being thought of. I looked out at the hydrangeas across the path. Their petals caught the light like folded silk. For the first time, I didn't see his flowers, I saw mine. I sat there for over an hour. People came and went. The wind picked up. My thermos went cold. But I stayed. Not in mourning, in communion. Not with a ghost, with a truth. And when I finally rose to leave, I placed the note back in its crevice. Maybe not for anyone else to find. Maybe just to let it remain in the world a little longer. Because some love, the truest kind, doesn't arrive wrapped in roses or spoken in perfect words. It's left in places, in benches, in quiet letters, in the hands of women who stayed. The weeds had taken over the back garden. I hadn't touched it in months, not since before the hospital, before the letters, before the truth crept in like water through the floorboards. It used to be his space. He trimmed the hedges, chose the mulch, argued about which flowers were worth the water. I just planted what he said wouldn't survive. And most of the time, I was right. That morning, I stood at the edge of the patio with a pair of old gloves and a dull spade. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't look at that mess of dead things and forgotten roots without wanting to tear something out. The first rip of a weed felt good. The second, even better. I worked without thinking, my hands deep in soil, sweat gathering behind my neck, the sun making shadows out of old regrets. I wasn't gardening. I was unearthing. Every root I yanked, every thorn I bled for, felt like a sentence I had swallowed over the years. It's fine. Don't worry about me. If you're tired, I can handle it. I ripped out the rosemary bush he always said was too wild. I pulled the creeping ivy from the brick wall, the one he insisted we just let grow. I dug into the earth like it had insulted me, like it had held his secrets, and now owed me something in return. By midday, I was filthy, knees stained, fingers raw, arms trembling. But I didn't stop, because underneath the rage was something else. A stillness, a whisper of creation. I began clearing space, not just from anger, but for possibility. What if this garden could be mine now? What if it didn't have to be tidy or practical or low maintenance? What if it bloomed how I wanted? Wild, messy, unapologetically alive. The next day, I went to the nursery alone. I picked flowers he never liked. Lavender, tall and proud. Snapdragons, wild and strange. Sunflowers, because they reach for the light no matter how heavy their heads get. I chose colors that didn't match. I asked questions. I laughed with the woman at the register. When she asked what the occasion was, I said, "I'm planting something for myself." She smiled, but she didn't understand. No one really could. Back home, I planted each flower with care. Not just as decoration, but as memory. Each bloom was a decision. Lavender, for the nights I stayed awake worrying about sons who didn't call. Sunflowers, for the mornings I smiled through the silence. Wild violets, for the girl I used to be, the one who danced barefoot before she was told to be quiet. I didn't pray, I didn't speak to the soil, but I felt something shift with every hole I filled, every root I tucked in. This wasn't a garden grown in grief. This was a garden built in defiance. A garden that said, I am still here, I am still growing, I am not done. And when I stood back that evening, sweat dripping, heart thudding, I didn't see chaos. I saw claiming, not revenge, not erasure, just space, my space. And for the first time in months, I slept with the window open so I could smell the lavender and remember, the ground beneath me is mine now. The train station was nearly empty. A few teenagers slumped against their backpacks, a couple arguing quietly by the ticket machine, and a man in a worn-out suit checking his watch for the third time. I stood by the platform holding a small suitcase and a paper cup of coffee, my first trip alone, ever. Not for a funeral, not for family, not for obligation, just to be somewhere else. To hear a new kind of silence. The ticket in my coat pocket read, Coastal Line, single, one way. I didn't know how long I'd stay. I didn't even know if the hotel I'd chosen would have decent pillows. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was going. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a widow, just as me. When the train doors opened, I stepped in and took the window seat. As it pulled away from the station, I watched my town shrink into the distance. The grocery store, the pharmacy, the street we lived on. None of it felt like home anymore. Not in a sad way, in a freeing way. I arrived in a small coastal village, the kind with narrow cobblestone streets, flower boxes in windows, and salt in the air. The sea was everywhere, even when you couldn't see it. You could feel it in the wind, in your lungs. I checked into a modest inn with creaky floors and lace curtains. The woman at the front desk asked, "Will you be expecting anyone else?" "No," I said, with the smallest, truest smile. That first evening, I walked to the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The wind pulled at my scarf, and the waves below roared like they had something urgent to say. I stood there for a long time, and then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I sang, not loudly, not perfectly, but with breath. A song from when I was 17, before marriage, before bills, before the constant folding of myself into smaller shapes to fit the corners of someone else's life. The next day, I went to a theater, alone. I sat in the middle row, surrounded by couples and groups and women with loud laughter. No one noticed me, and for once, I didn't feel invisible. I felt untethered, like I had floated out of a story that was never fully mine. That night, I ordered a glass of wine at a restaurant with no TV and real candlelight. I wore the red dress again, unapologetically. The waiter, a young man with kind eyes, told me I looked elegant, not beautiful, not young for your age, elegant. And I said, "Thank you," without shrinking. I ate slowly. I savored each bite. I listened to conversations I wasn't part of and smiled at the ones that sounded familiar. There was no need to be seen, but I was present. Back in my room, I opened the window to the sound of waves and let the night air wrap around me like an old, trusted shawl. And I thought of him, not in bitterness, not in ache, just in understanding. He had never learned how to find this part of life, and maybe he never would have, but I had. And even if I had arrived late, breathless, and with a suitcase full of questions, I had arrived, me, for the first time. I waited until just before sunset. There's a certain hour, just before the sky gives up its color, when everything turns gold, not bright, not blinding, but soft, forgiving. That's when I sat down to write, not to him, not really, to myself, to the woman who stayed quiet, to the girl who dreamed loud, to the wife who folded her needs like laundry, to the widow who dared to unfold them again. I chose my favorite paper, the one with the faint lavender lines, and wrote with the pen he gave me on our 30th anniversary. It still worked, barely. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. If you're listening, I want you to know I no longer wait for your footsteps in the hallway. I no longer flinch when I pass your chair. I no longer whisper your name when the room grows cold. I have learned that grief is not a cage, but a gate, one that opens, not just to sorrow, but to self. I forgave you, long before I said it aloud, not because you earned it, but because I needed to let go of the weight of your silence. I planted a garden with flowers you never liked, wore the dress you never understood, danced to the music you always turned down, and it felt like resurrection. You loved me in your way, and I loved you in mine, but now I am learning to love me, not in pieces, but whole. I hope, wherever you are free. I hope you finally forgave yourself. I hope you know I do not carry you with bitterness. I carry you like a scar, not ugly, not forgotten, just healed. If you're listening, then hear this. I'm still here. I'm still alive. And this, finally, is my life. I folded the letter, sealed it, and wrote no name on the front. Some things don't need destinations. That night, I lit a single candle and placed it on the garden windowsill, just beside the lavender. It flickered against the glass like a heartbeat. Not his, mine. I made tea, opened the window, and sat alone. No longer waiting, no longer asking, just being. I used to think growing old meant fading. Now I know it means becoming. We don't lose ourselves with time. We reveal ourselves, layer by layer, grief by grief, until what's left isn't what others gave us, but what we chose to keep. And I choose this: softness, solitude, unapologetic joy, and the wild, stubborn truth that it's never too late to meet yourself fully, even if it's in the final chapter.